When the sun set over ancient Rome, the city didn't sleep. It changed. The respectable world, merchants, senators, patrons, and their clients, disappeared behind locked doors. And in their place, another Rome emerged. A darker Rome. A louder Rome. A Rome of taverns, brothels, alleyways, and desperation. This was not the Rome of marble temples and triumphal arches. This was the Rome most historians only hinted at, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in outrage. A Rome preserved in graffiti on the walls of Pompeii and Herculaneum, frozen in time when volcanic ash sealed entire streets like insects trapped in amber. This was a city that smelled of open sewers, cheap wine, frying meat, and human survival. Depending on who you were, it was either the most thrilling place in the ancient world, or the most disgusting. So tonight, let's walk into it. Let's see what really happened after dark in the outskirts of ancient Rome, in the suburbium. The neighborhoods just beyond the city center, where the rules were looser, the watch was weaker, and the night lasted much longer. The first thing you noticed was the noise. Roman cities were already loud during the day. In fact, Julius Caesar once banned wheeled vehicles from the city center in daylight because the sound of carts rumbling over stone streets had become unbearable. But that didn't stop the traffic. It simply moved it to the night. After sunset, the streets thundered with iron-rimmed wheels, shouting drivers, braying animals, cracking whips, and the non-stop chaos of a city resupplying itself in darkness. And beneath all of that was another kind of noise, the sound of people who didn't belong in Rome's respectable daytime order, freed slaves trying to survive in a world that had given them legal freedom, but little real security. Immigrants from across the empire packed into the cheapest rooms they could find. Laborers, drifters, gamblers, and thieves. People living in the margins of the greatest city on earth. The danger of the Roman night wasn't always dramatic. It wasn't usually knife fights in moonlit alleys. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of danger where things could go wrong in an instant and leave almost no trace. Rome did have a night watch, the vigiles. There were around 7,000 of them for a city that may have held close to 1 million people. That sounds impressive, until you realize what they were actually there for. Their main job wasn't stopping crime. It was stopping fire, and in a city packed with wooden upper floors, crowded apartment blocks, open flames, and narrow streets, fire was a constant nightmare. Petty theft, drunken assaults, illegal deals, prostitution, and gambling, most of that simply happened around them. The night economy of Rome largely ran on its own rules. If you wanted to understand Roman nightlife, you didn't start at the palace. You started at the thermopolium, the Roman tavern or hot food stall. In Pompeii alone, archaeologists have uncovered more than 80 of them in a town of only about 11,000 people. That tells you everything. Eating and drinking in public wasn't just common in Rome. It was essential. But after dark, the tavern became something else entirely. It wasn't just a place to grab food and watered down wine. It was a gambling den, a meeting point, a workplace, a rumor mill, a hiring hall, a debt office, and a place where unofficial deals got made far from the eyes of respectable society. These taverns were often tied to collegia, semi-legal associations of tradesmen, freedmen, immigrants, and laborers. Part guild, part social club, part mutual aid network, and sometimes part street-level power structure. Roman authorities deeply distrusted these groups, because they organized exactly the kind of people Rome feared most: the poor, the mobile, the disconnected, the people with nothing to lose. And then there was the wine. If you imagine a clean glass of rich red wine, forget it. Roman wine was usually diluted with water. Drinking it straight was considered crude, even barbaric. But the diluted version wasn't exactly safe either. It could be mixed with herbs, honey, spices, even seawater as a preservative. And in some cases, it was sweetened with lead acetate, created by boiling grape syrup in lead vessels. Yes, lead. So common was this practice that some modern historians believe chronic lead poisoning may have been widespread among heavy Roman drinkers. That in cheaper taverns, things got worse. Wine could be stretched, altered, or adulterated with ingredients that were questionable, at best. A night of drinking in a low-end Roman tavern wasn't just social. It was chemical roulette, and then we come to one of the most revealing parts of Roman nightlife: prostitution. In ancient Rome, prostitution was legal. It was taxed. It was regulated. And like everything else in Roman society, it was organized into a strict hierarchy. At the top were elite courtesans, educated, expensive, and sometimes close to powerful men. But that world was far removed from the reality of the suburbium. At the bottom were the women and men, working the streets and the cheap brothels. Their lives appear not in glamorous literature, but in graffiti, legal records, and the cramped remains of the buildings where they worked. In Pompeii, the famous Lapena, the city's best-known brothel, contained tiny stone rooms barely large enough for a cot. Above the doorways were explicit paintings, essentially advertising the services inside. The people working there were overwhelmingly slaves or former slaves. For many, this was not a profession. It was survival, and Roman law made that brutally clear. Prostitution was tolerated for the men who bought it. But the people who sold it were often labeled infames, a legal category that stripped them of major social and civic protections. They could be denied full respectability, excluded from legal privileges, and treated as socially dishonored. In other words, Rome allowed their bodies to be used while denying them the dignity of full personhood. After midnight, the streets of the Roman suburbs became a study in inequality. The wealthy moved through the dark in litters, carried by slaves and surrounded by torchbearers. They traveled with light, status, and protection. The poor walked on foot, in darkness, on streets with no public lighting, and those streets were dangerous in ways modern people rarely imagine. Household waste was often dumped from upper-story windows. Apartment buildings could collapse. Drunks started fights. Thieves watched from the shadows. And every corner carried the risk of something stupid, violent, or humiliating. The Roman satirist Juvenal described walking Rome at night as an almost absurd act of bravery. His complaints sound darkly funny today: chamber pots falling from above, drunken brawlers, collapsing buildings, but behind the humor was a real truth. For ordinary people, Rome at night could be physically hostile. The suburbs were dominated by one structure more than any other: the insulae, Roman apartment blocks. These were the high-rise housing of the ancient world. Some reached 6 or 7 stories. They were packed with tenants, built from combinations of brick, wood, and stone, and often constructed as cheaply as possible. The lower floors were the most desirable. A shop or tavern might operate at street level. Better-off tenants lived closer to the bottom. The poorest residents were crammed into the upper stories, the hottest, least stable, and hardest to escape if a fire broke out below, and fires happened constantly. People cooked indoors, used open flames, lived shoulder to shoulder, and trusted landlords who often cared more about rent than repairs. For many Romans, the greatest danger of the night wasn't crime. It was waking up to smoke. But this is where most modern stories about ancient Rome get it wrong. Because the night wasn't just filth, vice, and violence. It was also alive: street performers, musicians, acrobats, storytellers, astrologers, fortune tellers, magicians, or at least people Rome called magicians. They filled the spaces between taverns and brothels with entertainment for people who had spent the day working brutal hours. For the Roman poor, the night was often the only time life felt remotely like their own. These weren't passive victims of history. They built communities. They celebrated local festivals. They worshipped household gods. They gathered at neighborhood shrines. They joked. They flirted. They argued. They survived. The graffiti of Pompeii proves it. It's full of insults, political slogans, love notes, jokes, sexual boasts, and petty rivalries. Not the voice of people crushed into silence. The voice of people fully, loudly, messily alive. So what does the Roman suburban night actually show us? Not just ancient decadence. Not just urban squalor. It shows us what happens at the bottom of any deeply unequal society after the top goes to bed, the deals that can't happen in daylight. The freedoms that only exist in darkness. The communities built by people excluded from respectability. The economies of survival. The pleasures of the poor. The risks they were forced to accept. And the stubborn human need to find connection, meaning, and even joy in places history usually ignores. The torches flickered in the alleyways. The wine was bad. The beds were worse. The vigiles made their rounds and mostly looked the other way, and in the narrow streets between the insulae, thousands of people that history barely remembered went on with the business of being alive, loudly, messily, and as defiantly human as anyone who has ever lived.